one lesson that we are learning very, very quickly is taking your data to AI is not a good idea. What is a better idea is bring your AI to data.
This is Sovereign DBaaS Decoded, a podcast for IT leaders and implementers looking to reliably scale database ops while maintaining control of their data stack. In each episode, we join industry experts to discuss the what and why of sovereignty and how you can implement the sovereign DBaaS concept of your own using open source databases, deployment models, and tooling. Let's get started.
Hello, and welcome to 2024's first episode of Sovereign DBaaS Decoded. I'm Vinay Joosery, and this episode is brought to you by several nines. Our guest today is Sanjeev Mojhan, Principal Analyst at SanjMo and former Gartner Research VP. Thanks for joining us today. So, Sanjeev, what's new?
So, Vinay, thank you so much. It seems like an annual pilgrimage for me to start my year by being on your podcast. So, for the second year in a row, I'm honored to be on it. So to answer your question of what's new and what's going on, I have to say 2024, just the number seems a bit magical. It seems it's a leap year. It feels like this is a year we will really leap forward. And although I have to say that I've entered the year with a lot of excitement and momentum, but I'm also noticing there's a lot of trepidation in the markets, if I may say so. What I mean by that is, while most of the people I talk to are quite upbeat about 2024, I also feel there's a little bit of like hesitation. There's a lot going on in our world right now, uh, and which we'll talk about, but there is a little bit of caution. So companies are saying that we are excited about 2024, but, and the feeling I'm getting is that companies want to take it cautiously Q1 and Q2. So the first half of 2024, and then they think that the rest of the year should be fine after that. But basically, they're being very careful with how much money they spend and where they spend it and the investments they make, uh, hoping that, if things don't improve, then they should be able to last the whole year with whatever their budget is.
Yes. Actually, that's and in a way, it's kind of sets the stage for the recap we'll do for 2023, right? Before we get there, actually, let me say this is our 10th episode of the Sovereign, DBaaS, podcast.
Very
right?
nice.
So I never thought we'd get past 3 or 4. So so we're happy that people are listening. We're happy that we've had a bunch of guests, right? And in a way, our hunch was correct when we launched the podcast, right? People want to hear about data sovereignty, and during that time, like last year, even the top 2 hyperscalers, AWS and Microsoft, they came out with their own sovereign cloud programs, right? So so that's kind of like that's interesting. I remember when we spoke, you were like, well, from the US point of view, sovereignty, maybe it's more of an EU thing. But we found it interesting that that all the hyperscalers actually they have these sovereign cloud programs, and probably thinking like, okay, India has their own their own law now, right, on data protection. A bunch of other countries as well, right? So that was a good move actually to start this podcast, and our episodes have been downloaded more than 1,000 times, right? So now we are back with you where we started in a way, right, 1 year ago. And so what can we expect for today? Well, we'll talk a bit about the state of cloud, right? Sanjeev you gave us your hunch about 2024, right? We'll actually first recap the cloud and the DB space in 23, right? And we'll do it in 3 stages: influences, events, and surprises, right? So we'll see what's going on today after that, and then we'll look forward to 24, right? So taking the influences, we saw more instability in the world, right? I mean, from the geopolitical scene, it's just getting mad, right? And we also see a more restrictive business environment, which you are guessing that it will actually continue. Um, I mean, if we thought the end of 22 was bad, 23 got worse in terms of layoffs, right? Inflation, central banks hiking interest rates. So, Sanjeev, how do you think these macro influences have affected the cloud market?
I'm reminded of something I heard from some of my peers, that the CEO of AWS was saying that he's seen good times, he's seen bad times, but these are neither. They're uncertain times. So that and the uncertainty has come in this year because, first of all, in the US where I'm based, we have a major election coming up, which happens every 4 years. But we're not the only ones. There are over 50 countries. More than half the population is having elections this year. So that although I don't let these things come in my way, I think a lot of these things are noise, but still, people are affected. Elections, we have a couple of wars going on in the world, which every day you read, they just seem to be there's a flashpoint and they're expanding. Um, so so these things cause companies to reconsider and think, what should we be doing this year? So I know we talk about politics and some of these non-technical topics, but then there's this whole uncertainty, if you may, which has been introduced by AI. And it's like, how transformative is AI? I see articles every day saying that AI will add every year, McKinsey says that $4 trillion a year to the global GDP, which will increase by 7 to 20% on an annual basis, which is a lot of potential. But then you also see very next to it is an article that says, is the generative AI hype over? So what is it? Is it overhyped? Is it underhyped? Or is it normal? So these are a lot of issues that every company has to grapple with before they know where to make the right bets. That's something which I feel is adding to a little bit of uncertainty around us.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. And actually, in terms of events, we can certainly say that, you know, t- 23 was probably the year of generative AI, right? And it helped quite a few companies offset losses in value, right? If you think about, some companies like, Adobe, Nvidia, it kind of pushed up all the valuations, right? So from that point of view, that has driven a lot, right? Um, Another event, which is actually, which actually in the EU, it had quite a big impact, I would say, there was some updates on the Schrems too. So last year there was an adequacy decision, right, for EU to US data flows, right? And and basically it means that data transfers from the EU to the USA, they are not objectionable from a data protection perspective. And that's based on an executive order of President Biden in 2022. Which is called Enhancing Safeguards for United States Signals Intelligence Activities, right? So what it means is, we've done it 2 times now, right? We've had some kind of framework to transfer data. Then there was Schrems 1, it was canceled. Then there was a new framework. Schrems 2 happened, it was canceled. Now we're kind of getting into this, well, it's kind of okay anyway. And now the bets are on for Schrems 3, right? So it's kind of like, can an enterprise really trust that they can follow this? Because it's been overruled 2 times and the basic facts, right, haven't changed, right? In Europe, we have a very different way of looking at, privacy compared to the US, right? And there are surveillance laws in the US and they won't change those laws, right? So, and then there was one final thing that I thought was interesting. There was some profile outages and security breaches, including MongoDB, which is quite a major DBaaS provider. Um, and then obviously VMware acquired by Broadcom. We talk about private cloud. I mean, that's just huge. We saw that Broadcom ended the partner program for VMware. So a lot of partners are actually wondering what's gonna happen to us, right? So what's your take on this event, Sanjeev? Um,
Yeah.
you already mentioned AI,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. I won't actually go back to AI, but another very important from a political point of view or economics point of view is this whole inflation and interest rates. So, to answer some of your questions about what's happening on the business side, a lot of companies got heavily funded in 2021 when we had the almost zero interest rate going on. So now with this inflation and all these other things we talked about, we don't have a lot of runway. A lot of companies this year are going to have a rude awakening and find out that, whatever valuation they had 2 years ago is no longer going to be the case. So if they need to raise more money, uh, that will be interesting. I don't think there's a shortage of money, by the way. I think uh, LPs have a lot of money to spend. They just don't know where to spend it. And they, like I said, they're being cautious where to spend. So it's not the shortage of money. It is that these companies will have to swallow a bitter pill and, you know, go in with a down round. We might see some mergers and acquisitions going on, although some companies may be just a fire sale. So it may be an M&A on paper, but it's really, they just shut down. So there's a lot of trepidation. But now to go back once again to AI and the regulations. So while I know Schrems 1, Schrems 2, and now we're into Schrems 3, the the EU AI Act, at least the new version, because there was already a version for many years, but the new one came into effect in 2023, literally a few weeks ago. My personal feeling is that Europeans over-index on privacy, and like you said, we've tried a couple of different versions and we haven't really succeeded. Now we're trying again, but the problem is that AI is morphing and changing faster than we can pin it down. So, I just feel that in a traditional database environment where things were very static or well known or well defined, like with a data warehouse, you could still have some rules and regulations in place. But with AI, with the speed at which it's moving, I don't know how privacy acts can keep up with that. Even in the US, we already, you saw just a few weeks ago, New York Times sued OpenAI. OpenAI is fighting.
correct.
OpenAI is like, no, I'm sorry, this is derivative work. This is not your original work, and there are all kinds of like arguments that are being made on both sides of the pond as to what we should be doing. So I just feel that these acts are going to be in the process of trying to keep up with the advancements in AI and catch up. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I just feel that because we don't because AI, the generative AI piece, not AI itself, but AI piece is relatively new.
Correct.
We just need to Europe needs to decide what side of the battle we need to be on. And I'm being very honest here. People, a lot of your followers are in Europe. They may not want to hear me say these things, but I feel Europe lost badly in the cloud business. Like literally, they don't even play in that
Yeah.
space. Uh, it's all American companies, except in China, they have a thriving uh, cloud service providers. But Europe, with all this emphasis on privacy, never really managed to create an alternative to AWS's, Google, Microsoft Azure of the world. And they should have, because privacy is so important. So let's not make the same mistake for AI, is my point.
Yeah, and I will totally agree with you. I think, looking at market shares and everything, hyperscalers are, number one, number two, number three. I mean, it's like, they have like, most of the market. And I
Yes.
don't know. I mean, I don't know how we get there, how we got there, but for sure, AI is another space. But again, the usual suspects are, they are very well positioned to take that market, right? And I mean, looking at in terms of surprises, we looked at like generative AI, how much it grew. I mean, it had a huge impact on, for example, people like Nvidia, right? I mean, they do the picks and shovels of AI, right? Their market value tripled, right? Then the other thing is you don't do AI without databases, right? So there are these vector databases which we saw a lot of, right? So um, there are pure databases like Pinecone, Milvus. Then you have existing databases that have their own, vector search, right? For example, Postgres with pgvector, right? Speaking of which, we added it to the list of extensions that we support, right?
Oh, very.
Um, yeah, so for me that was a surprise, for last year. All these vector databases getting funded, because it seems that the database market keeps growing and growing every 2 years. There's something new that comes in and kind of
Yeah,
expands, right?
correct.
Uh, right. I mean, the other thing was sovereignty, right? So we made a bet in 22 that sovereignty would become a concern, right? But we could not predict the spate of sovereignty initiatives, right, from the hyperscalers. And AWS and Microsoft, right, they announced their sovereign cloud programs just last year, 3-4 months ago, right? And in a way, it kind of brings confusion to the EU market, right? Because these products are only sovereign insofar as the agreements allow, right? I mean, if there's a Schrems free and it invalidates, the the sort of agreement that the EU made with Mr. Biden, then customers will be back to square one, right? And I think for an enterprise, it's kind of strange to navigate, right? But again, there's not, like, as you mentioned, we don't have those superpower companies, tech companies in Europe, where you can say, they can get the technology from Europe itself, right? And finally, there's one thing, we've partnered with a partner for many years, a company, MariaDB, and that one, it's sad to see, MariaDB Inc. is in big trouble. I mean, in a way, they were listed on New York Stock Exchange, in December 22. They were trading at $11.50, right? The stock now is down to 18 cents, right? They've had layoffs. They've ditched Expand, which used to be Clustrix, which was this kind of like, clustered database running on multiple nodes.
To
And
DBaaS.
then obviously,
DBaaS anymore.
correct,
Yes.
they had their SkySQL DBaaS.
Well,
So not sure what's next for these guys. But
yes.
does any of these surprise you, Sanjeev?
Yeah, actually, I I was quite a fan of MariaDB and the work they were doing. When I was in Gartner, I'd been to their event. They used to do very big event, and I was upbeat on MariaDB because MariaDB's deployment is actually pretty big. ServiceNow uh, embeds MariaDB, and they have over 100,000 deployments. So it came as a surprise to me that they just this thing they went on so quickly, and now they're a small shell. I still talk to them because some of the people, some of my good friends are still there, but a lot of people I know have since been let go. I wonder if they made the mistake of going public. They went public through this SPAC,
SPAC, yeah.
and I think that was a big mistake. They shouldn't have stayed private, because then they could have navigated this. Once you're a public company, you're exposed. Everybody knows what's going on. Uh, so maybe that was not the smartest move. And I think going public using the SPAC vehicle, to me, is a little bit of a red herring anyway.
The thing is, when they went public with the SPAC, there was a lot of bad writing about SPAC in general, about
Yes,
that mechanism.
correct.
So yeah, I don't know, but
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, it's sad to see the company almost imploding,
yes,
and probably, yeah, maybe it will be picked up by
yeah.
by maybe
I,
maybe some acquirer.
yeah, and very interesting to see where MySQL is going. Oracle, for many, many years, uh, tried was again, I'm saying these things. I hope people don't take it the wrong way, but I felt Oracle was in denial with their MySQL existence, because Oracle has such a flourishing DBMS market. And by the way, I started my career at Oracle, and think very highly of Oracle. But MySQL now has taken on a new form with HeatWave, and it's now not just a transactional database, but it's got transactional and analytical capabilities. Uh, and one more point I want to make, and then I want to hand it over to you, is you mentioned about vector databases. What started as a very exciting new use case of a database, which is to store the vector embeddings, so you can then do a vector search, has now become table stakes. So having vector search in a database is no longer a differentiation. The only differentiation that remains is now, how can you take the vector search capability and have that workload coexist with your traditional workloads. And this is why I like, so many different databases now have a vector search capabilities, because they're trying to say, you know what, you could already do an OLTP, you could do OLAP. Then we introduce full text search using Lucene, and now we've got vector search. So it's very exciting, in my opinion.
Yeah, and in a way, I think it follows a little bit the trends that we've seen, right? I mean, we talked about polyglot persistence, right? Like we've talked about that for, I don't know, since 10 years ago, right? And then what we saw was that suddenly, people started adding maybe a key value interface, maybe they had graph capabilities, right? And then the question is, what does the enterprise do? Do they continue maybe selecting, right, specialized databases? Because then they're going to end up with a lot of databases, and that maybe it doesn't work too well, right? Or do they go multimodal, right? Because like their Postgres that they're using, or their
Mm.
Oracle, already has all these capabilities, right? So I think that's something that even we've seen with the graphs and other new
So
things.
I want to add two points. So first of all, I completely agree with you. I'm a huge. In fact, if you read between the lines of what I just said, multimodal databases, in my opinion, are the way to go. But the second point I also want to make is that it's the same is true for graph database, but there are a couple of people like Neo4j, for example, has done very well in graph. So maybe there's an opportunity for just a handful of vector database standalone products to do really well, because they do things so well. For example, Pinecone is the leader in vector databases in my mind, from the commercial point of view. There are many other, or like open source, Milverse, Quadrant. There are a lot of really good options. Some are even embedded. But let's talk about Pinecone. I saw their announcement from literally a day ago, where they talked about some new capabilities that will reduce hallucinations down to zero when you build your RAG pipelines. So if they do that, then that could be a game changer. So having a standalone database actually may not be such a bad idea if you can
Correct.
introduce capabilities that are far beyond what you would find in a highly integrated database. The
Correct. Yeah. And
second point, another point I want to make, by the way, talking about Pinecone, is last year Snowflake introduced this whole new engine called Snowpark Container Services. So on the same data, you can now you don't have to use Snowflake's native engine. You can use a containerized engine where you can even pick and say, I don't want to run it on CPUs. I want to run it on GPUs. In that container, you can run Pinecone. So interestingly, what happens is that now I can take my data in Snowflake, turn that data into vector embedding, and store it in a containerized Pinecone, all within my VPC. So that's another interesting point I wanted to raise.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, for sure. I think I totally agree. With you there. There are capabilities that obviously, if you are specialized on doing vector search, then you'll have more time to add more things, right? Whereas the big oracles or even Postgres, they have so much to work on. So that's tough. So looking a little bit at these influences and events that we talked about, right, for last year. I mean, the question is, you mentioned Q1, Q2, maybe companies will be in a little bit of a kind of waiting mode because there's so much insecurity. Now, my question to you is, in terms of cloud strategy, right? I mean, are companies transitioning from cloud first to cloud smart, right? Will hybrid become more of a viable option, right? Because we know that, public cloud is very expensive. And as you mentioned in the previous podcast, it's not like, you have very, very variable kind of workloads, right? A lot of workloads are just, kind of normal.
Able, yeah,
And I mean, what are your thoughts there in terms of this
yeah,
hybrid or?
yeah. I think hybrid is coming back to some extent. I want to be careful by saying that that does not mean things are moving to on premises. We will still see cloud migrations, but it's not going to be the winner takes it all. Everything must move to the cloud. On premises deployments are actually starting to look pretty attractive because some of these things that I talked about, like containerized services, some of the things that we put under cloud native are now available on premises. So I now have an option where I can take the latest and the greatest binary from the cloud, but run it on the data that sits within my safe and secure, or seemingly safe and secure on-premises environment. So if I have happen to be in an environment where I am very skeptical about moving to the cloud for various reasons, security being one of them, but it could be latency, it could be regulations. I can now take advantage of the cloud operating model on premises, you even see that in announcements from Dell, for instance. Dell with Red Hat OpenShift is now saying that we give you the entire AI ecosystem, so you don't have to move your data to the cloud. The second point I also want to make is that one lesson that we are learning very, very quickly is taking your data to AI is not a good idea. What is good? What is a better idea is bring your AI to data. If you are going to train a model, which is still we are still in early stages of an end user training their own AI model, we are still doing RAG and some fine tuning. But if NVIDIA Grace Hopper chips become really cheap and Intel, AMD, Qualcomm, ARM based, all these become commodity for training and inference, then a lot of these workloads will move to the edge or to on premises because now because the cost has gone down. In such a case, We want to move AI to where the data already exists. To train an AI model, we need a lot of data for it to be of value. Where is that data? If it's in the cloud, okay, fine, train it there. But if it never moved to the cloud for whatever reasons, let's bring AI to where the data is, train it there, and once the model is ready, if we can have a smaller model, I can even put it on an edge device. Like Androids, I saw another announcement just yesterday how Samsung and Google Cloud are now collaborating to run some of Google's models on these Android phones.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Now, let me get your spin on these. I mean, we talked about costs, right? Cost is kind of a big driver in this, right? I mean, one way that those typical hyperscalers are, kind of optimizing the cost is through, these multi-year contracts, right? So this means committed spend, which seems closer to the CapEx model than the OpEx one, right? But you don't own the asset, right? So if you have the committed spend, right, because that's kind of what the enterprise can say is like, okay, let's do a contract with hyperscaler A, and then we'll commit to using, X amount of $1 million or whatever, right, in the next 3 years, right? And then you got to pay it even if you don't use it, right? But then it feels a little bit like it's a bit of a CapEx model, right? But then you don't own it. You don't own the asset, right? So because it's not an operational expense that you can actually just turn down, right? If your company is trying to cut costs. So, I mean, I don't know if you have any experience in this, but what are the implications for companies who got themselves in these contracts? Are we saying like, okay, we chose cloud first as our direction, and we'll just continue down that road, right? Understanding that it costs more, or right, as you mentioned, since we can do the cloud model through our own environments, right? We have the cloud operating model. We have all the tool sets today, right, to do that. And all the enterprises going to look at that and say, okay, yes, we signed that contract, but actually maybe, we got to start looking at alternatives. Like, you mentioned edge, right? On-prem colocation, managed service providers or any other alternative environments. What do you think?
Reserved capacity thing is a conundrum. But when you don't have too many choices, then okay, fine. Reserved capacity is how we saved cost. If we reserved our capacity for 1 year or 3 years, then we got a favorable pricing. But now I'm also starting to hear how difficult it is to estimate what that reserved capacity should be. For example, many of my clients will tell me that I had expected to spend X amount of money over 3 years, but with these new use cases, I've already in 6 months, I've already spent that money. So I'm running hot on my budget. I've exceeded it. Some companies tell me that we had excess capacity available. And if I'm not mistaken, I don't track this space very well. So Vinay, remind me, I thought if you had excess capacity, you could make it available on marketplace, but I think AWS has shut that down recently.
Yeah, I'm not sure. What I know is I just read, in the news that some large company had bought a lot of capacity,
Yeah.
and then they didn't use it all, but
Yeah.
then they actually managed to get somehow a discount into their next contract, so that
I see. Okay.
that unused credit was kind of
Yeah.
moved into the next one.
What really amazes me about reserve capacity, very interesting case, slightly tangential to what we are discussing, but still very relevant. I was looking at some benchmark numbers where somebody had compared the cost of running a workload on premises with a cloud. But then, when I dug deeper, I was like, wait, the cloud cost that you are comparing it with is a reserved instance cost. So it's actually amortized over 3 years. So you cannot take that number because you're paying for 3 years. So you cannot take that number at a point in time and then compare it to on-prem because that's already discounted in the cloud. And so people are playing all kinds of like interesting tricks with this concept. So,
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, in a way, um, if people are moving more towards, diversified environments, right, that will take care of vendor lock-in, right? Because, I mean, most of the analysts are kind of, talking about the, the blast radius of potential incidents, right? There's more vendor lock-in. You have potential large-scale events, right? That can affect a lot of companies. Um, and also to improve, navigability of the regulatory, landscape, right? Because if you are in control of your environment, it's not just cloud first, but you can decide where to deploy things based on regulation. Then you have more control, right? Because we've seen new data protection laws. Like last year, India, right? Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, right? Have you seen any effect on the data protection law in India, for example, on all these enterprises doing business? I mean, maybe it's too early to say.
yeah, I think it's too early. If I'm not mistaken, in India, it's still an act. I didn't. I haven't kept up, so I'm not sure if it's already a law or
It's a
it's.
law. It's a law
Mhm.
since last year. Yeah, I
I
think
see.
October. Yeah,
Okay. Well, I'll
yeah. I
look
think they
into that.
tried. They tried for several years and they didn't
Yes.
manage. But then last year it became a law. Yeah.
Okay. It became a law. I see. Okay. I'll have to look into that.
Okay.
Uh,
All right. So looking forward to 24, right? What can we expect? We talked about more data protection regulations. We can expect governments expanding, privacy regulations. Um, Based on the fact that the three main hyperscalers are now offering, quote unquote, sovereign clouds. Um, I mean, is that evidence that regulations have some teeth to them? What do you think?
Yeah. I see GDPR finally is starting to show its teeth after many years of not being that proactive or, but now I see that is happening quite a bit. Talking about what's going to happen in near future, I have to say we are seeing a very interesting trade-off uh, between having control over your workloads by bringing in the best of breed tools versus going to a cloud provider and taking their integrated offering where you don't have full control, but you get a few things in your favor. For example, Microsoft last year introduced this concept of Microsoft Fabric. I feel that Microsoft Fabric is made of a lot of piece parts. It's got the database, the application environment, ingestion, ETL, transformation, catalog. A lot of these things are clubbed in. What I'm starting to see is that a lot of customers in the current economic times, where there's a lot of pressure on containing costs and accountability, are saying that how do we simplify our technical infrastructure? Do we really need to integrate the best of breed products, which actually provides very deep technology advantages, but I have to pay to integrate these? And then if something breaks, I have no idea. Did it break in Fivetran? Did it break in DBT, in Looker, in Snowflake? Why is my dashboard showing me the wrong information? So, but if I go to Microsoft Fabric, then maybe even from a regulation point of view, it is one neck to choke as opposed to five different ones. So you see, so it's a trade off. But then, welcome to when they lock in.
Yes. Yes, correct. I mean, I totally agree, but I think, in general, in times of tougher, tougher economic, conditions, you would say that, you wouldn't want to do, you, people would, they wouldn't be too brave and try to like, let me do this and that and this. I mean, it's probably simple, as you say, to get a platform where you don't have to take the cost of integration. It's the vendor that has already taken the cost of the integration, and you're getting it packaged, so to speak, and then you have this one neck to squeeze. Um, so looking at the economic environment, I mean, you mentioned it earlier on this call, right? We had big investments in tech during the COVID years, right? Then after that, companies started to cut down on costs. 23 was a tough year. And the question is, will 24 be better? You sort of mentioned Q1, Q2. It's kind of wait and see, and then we see what happens. But let's say if you would look further for the whole of 2024, right? Are we looking at a repeat of 23? Because I guess we will continue to suffer the effects of high inflation. How does this affect cloud spend, right? And will by the end of the year, will enterprise have diversified their cloud diet, right? Being cloud smart as opposed to cloud first?
Correct. I don't see a repeat of 2023. I have very high hopes. But then I've also my wife called me an insufferable optimist. So, and there's a reason why I feel 2024 will be different. 2023 was driven by all these geopolitical things we talked about and financial market. At some point, we have to put a kibosh on optimization and start innovating. We cannot just keep optimizing forever. I feel in 2024, we'll see a lot of consolidation happen. Some companies are going to suffer. You talked about job losses. Yes, a lot of job losses took place, but then we also overhired uh, and we had unrealistic expectations. So there had to be some rationalization of workforce. And, I feel bad for people when that happened. It's even happening in 2024. We're only 2 weeks into this year, and we've seen job losses at Google Cloud, at Amazon, Cloudflare, a bunch of companies lately, so it's still happening. But that's because of these uncertainty. This is the year when we have to say, okay, we've optimized, we've cut it down to the bone. Now, how do I get more competitive advantage? I have to invest. And maybe AI is that vehicle that I use to invest, but it will turn around is my sincere hope. Uh, that this year we will see more investments because you cannot stop technology from marching. So all those people who are saying that AI is going to take over our job, AI is going to take over the mankind, and AGI is going to subjugate us, I'm like, please stop. We
Yeah.
don't really know. Let's just use AI for the good it can do to our organization. There'll always be bad actors out there. No matter what is the new technology, that always that we cannot stop that. But this is the year to take a hard look at AI and see what are the use cases that I can put it to make my business more efficient, or to improve customer experience, or to improve developer productivity. There are just so many. There's no doubt of places where AI can help. Yes, it's not perfect. AI, generative AI, when hallucinate, things will get better, just like any technology. I'm telling you, 1994, when I first got into World Wide Web, the whole thing was just coming into existence. People were complaining, well, what the heck is World Wide Web? It's just static web pages. It's just documentation. And look what we can do now on the internet, pretty much everything.
Correct. Yeah.
So AI will get there. And by the way, we know that with every new technology, the runway to that level gets shorter and shorter, from radio to television to the internet to World Wide Web to now AI. So in another 3 to 4 years, some of the things will be embedded with AI and it'll be table stakes. We won't even think about it. Like we don't think about going to a bank in the middle of the night, which you cannot, to withdraw money. We just go to an ATM machine. It's just no brainer. So I think we'll see more of that in starting 2024 onward.
And actually, based on what you said earlier, if we're looking at AI being a driver for new investments, then you'll take AI to where the data is, right? It's not like
Yes.
you're going to shift and lift, put it
Correct.
somewhere else, right?
Correct.
So basically, if you
Yeah.
have your workloads in
Right.
your on-prem data centers or whatever, then probably you're looking at
Yeah.
augmenting that environment with AI capabilities
Yeah.
and getting the benefits of it.
Correct. Yes.
Right. Okay. Well, Sanjeev, this is great. Time to wrap up. I mean, always great to have you with us. Right. So, we've looked at 2023, how it has been tough economically, right? And probably much worse was it not for AI-driven workloads. And then it remains to be seen whether enterprises will avoid concentrating their workloads, right, on the hyperscalers, or maybe adopt a more sovereign approach, right? I mean, maybe this taking AI to the data would also match the sovereign approach because, I think I saw somewhere that, only 50% of workloads on the cloud. So there's still, most of it is not in the cloud,
Less than
right?
50. I think it's
Right.
less than 50. It's reaching equilibrium of 50%, but I think, again, it's very hard to pin it down. But I think from what I've seen, it's like in 40% rate, 46% is one of the surveys I saw. Unless you talk to AWS, they'll tell you it's only 15%.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us, Sanjeev. This was, very appreciated, and thank you all to our listeners, for joining us, and have a great 2024.
Thank you so much. Bye.